นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนัมมัสสามิ Blessings to you all. As a Buddhist monk, there are certain questions people like to ask you, and there's some questions that are more common than others. And one of the commonly asked questions is, Buddhists are concerned or worried whether they'll have the chance to become Buddhist again in future lives. Maybe you could say this is the disadvantage of practicing Buddhism, following the teachings, and you might say believing in rebirth and past lives and future lives. It brings up that question, where will I go after I die? What will happen? Will I become Buddhist again? Will I meet with the Buddhist teachings again? Or how can I assure myself or confirm that I'll be able to practice Buddhism in my future life? If you think about it, in a way, this is already admitting defeat, because you're saying, oh, well, I'm going to be born again. Because actually we're practicing not to be born again. We're practicing for Nibbana, which is, the Buddha described as the unborn, the undying. But nevertheless, realistically, we often realize perhaps we're not going to make it to Nibbana this life, so then we're wondering where we'll be next life. So the way you can tell where you'll go next life, or whether you have a chance to practice Buddhism next life, is, well, how do you treat the Buddhist teachings this life? How much of a refuge do you take in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha? Is that really your refuge in this life, at this time, today? Because this is a central part of the Buddhist teachings, is learning to take refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. First of all on the outside, but over time through the practice, finding these qualities on the inside, in our hearts, our minds, so that we can have a real solid refuge, the kind of refuge that will last from this life into the next. Because sometimes we are just taking a token refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. We say, I'm Buddhist, or I believe in Buddha, or I follow Buddha. But maybe we're more worried about other things, or more concerned. We spend more time thinking about and concerned about many other things in our life, more than Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha is sometimes relegated to second or third or fourth place. So the joke the monks have is, monks, we don't have money or bank accounts. But lay people, you have a bank account, so often your bank becomes your refuge. So I don't know what bank you have, whether you're in your national bank or some company, whether it's the Singapore National Bank, if they have such a thing, or in Australia, National Australia Bank. Maybe that's your refuge. So when we chant Buddhang Saranang Gacchami at the beginning of any kind of Buddhist ritual ceremony, like taking precepts, we say Buddhang Saranang Gacchami. But if you're taking refuge in your bank, maybe it's NAB Saranang Gacchami, or if you're in Australia, Commonwealth Bank Saranang Gacchami. If we're honest, sometimes that's where our refuge is. Or in England, I used to live in England, and I don't know about now because I haven't lived there recently, but in the old days everyone followed soccer. Everyone had their soccer team, and a lot of people were, we say, soccer crazy, football crazy, and it was like a religion. So, and people would say, my religion is my soccer team. And they even have graveyards next to soccer stadiums where people get buried after they die so they can be close to their soccer team. So it's like a religion. Or whatever else we may take refuge in life. Often it's Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha that is relegated to the second place, and this other refuge, whether it's money or sport or whatever it is that we cling on to, that becomes the priority. Maybe it's astrology. Many people, they run to the astrologer before they run to the monk when they have a problem or a worry about something. They're pregnant, or they've got to have a surgery, or they have some business deal coming up, and before they run to the monk for a blessing, they run to the astrologer to get the prediction what's going to happen. So that means they're taking a refuge in astrology more than in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, perhaps. So this is something to reflect on every day. What do I take refuge in? And if you want to have the chance to meet with the Buddhist teachings again in future lives, until you reach Nibbana, well, this is something you should consider. As we know, one of the attributes of the stream enterer is they have unshakable or firm faith, confidence in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, in the way of practice, the way of training, in Sila, Samadhi, Panya, the Eightfold Noble Path. They've established that beyond doubt. But until that point, these other refuges, false refuges, mistaken refuges, can often slip into our thinking and our worldview. So that may be what determines where we're reborn and what we take up next life, and whether we come back in a future time and meet with the Buddhist teachings again or not. If I remember, the Buddha said, your refuge is like what you keep returning to in your mind. So it's central to your mind, what you believe in, what you think of, what you take as valuable and important in your life. And he said, when you die, your mind is like a tree in a field. Like here, around this hall, we have grassy areas. The forest is further away because we have a fire break. In Australia, buildings, they need fire breaks around them. So we have a field around the hall. But we also have some single trees in the field. And the Buddha says, hey, you've got this one tree in the field. And every day the wind blows. And anywhere you are in the world, there'll tend to be one wind that is what we call the prevailing wind. There's a direction that the wind will blow from most often. So in this monastery, it comes from the southwest most often. You sometimes get northerly winds, but most wind comes from the southwest. So if you have a single tree standing in a field, every day it's going to get blown from the southwest. And that will affect the way the tree grows, how strong it is. It will have to compensate for the wind that's coming from a certain direction. So the roots and the trunk and the branches will reflect which direction the wind comes from. And then when the tree gets old and starts to die, and the roots get weak and the trunk gets weak, eventually the tree will fall over. And it will tend to fall according to the direction that it's been blown by the wind. So if the wind blows from the south, then it will tend to fall to the north because it's been blown that one way all these years. It's not absolutely sure that will happen, but generally that's what happens. It will blow over or fall over when it dies in one direction because the wind has been blowing it all its life from the other direction. And our mind is like that. If you keep inclining your mind towards Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, when you die and your mind and body separate, these 5 khandhas break apart, as we've been studying and meditating for many years now, I think you can all start to appreciate this body and mind, these 5 khandhas are impermanent. So the Buddha said when you die, they break up. There's nothing left of these 5 khandhas. You'll never be here again, looking like this, feeling like this, thinking like this. You'll disappear from the face of the world. But your stream of consciousness will lead on to new birth, rebirth, we say, or new birth, in a place. And if you're going to meet with the Buddhist teachings again, well, you'll have had to be thinking and practicing and having confidence in the Buddhist teachings all through your life, so that that's a strong part of your conditioning process. So that's like the wind through this life. It's been blowing in one direction, so when you die you fall in that direction towards the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. You'll reconnect with Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. You'll meet with the teachings again, because this life you've given importance to them. Similarly, if you've taken refuge in your bank or your soccer team or whatever else it is that you take refuge in, well, that may be what leads you on into your next life. And it may have nothing to do with Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. So if you want to answer this question, where will I get the chance to practice Buddhism next life if I haven't reached Nibbana yet? Well, that's your answer. Do you take refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha every day? So this is why sometimes people literally, they chant at least once a day, Buddhaṃ Saraṇaṃ Gacchāmi, or at least in their meditation they recollect the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, or this is why we bow. Ajahn Chah, my teacher, trained the monks and nuns to bow every day. When you come into the meditation hall, you bow. When you leave, you bow. When you go into your meditation hut in the forest, you bow. When you leave it, you bow. You bow so many times a day. But why do you do that? It's because every moment you bow, you're inclining your mind and your body towards Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. You're establishing that perception, that memory. You're remembering Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, and you're bringing up the qualities of Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha when you bow. Same when you bow to a teacher. It could be a monk or a nun. You bow, you're inclining yourself towards the qualities that teacher represents. You bow to the robes. As a Buddhist monk, I wear these robes. These robes I've inherited from the Buddha. We still sew them and cut them, sew them and dye them in the same way that the monks did in the time of the Buddha, because we have the model, the style stored in the Vinaya, the Buddhist discipline, the monks' discipline. So we still wear the same kind of robes that they wore in the time of the Buddha. So these robes symbolize Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. Whether the monk is enlightened or not, doesn't matter. You're bowing to the robes. When you bow to the robes, you can incline your mind to recollect Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. So just something as simple as bowing through the day, especially if you're in a monastery where it's kind of natural and normal to bow a lot, that's inclining your mind over and over again to recollect the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. It's taking refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. And even if you're a layperson at home, you before you leave your home to go to work or go to school, you can bow. If you have a Buddha statue or a Buddha picture of Buddha, you can bow. Make your aspiration, how you're going to practice through the day, maybe to keep the 5 precepts, to be mindful, follow the example of the Buddha, to develop mindfulness, wisdom, compassion through the day, for example. Or when you get in your car, if you drive to work, you can lift your hands in Anjali and think of the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. If you get on a plane to travel somewhere, you can recollect Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha at the beginning of the journey, and so on. You can recollect Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha as many times as you wish through the day. And at each moment your mind is as taking refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha in one way or another. You're establishing mindfulness. Maybe you're recollecting a certain quality that you find the Buddha or the Dhamma or the Sangha represent. So it could be just mindfulness. It could be it makes you mindful of the breath when you bow, or when you bring up the thought, recollecting the Buddha, you turn to the breath, and so the breath and the Buddha, or the breath and the Dhamma, or the breath and the Sangha become synonymous, become one thing. Every moment you're mindful of the breath is a moment you're also recollecting the Buddha, or taking refuge in the Buddha. Or it could be practicing vipassana. Every moment that you're observing the arising and passing away of sensations in your body, or a thought, or a feeling, or a memory, and you're mindful of impermanence, that's a moment you're also taking refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. You're taking refuge in the Dhamma, aren't you? The Dhamma of impermanence. And we say that when your mind inclines towards Dhamma, you see the truth, you're mindful of a thought arising, passing away, or a sound, hearing a sound rising, passing away. You're becoming mindful of the Dhamma. Your mind becomes the Dhamma at that moment. When there's mindfulness, wisdom, insight into anicca, into impermanence. It's like you're with the Buddha, you're with the Dhamma for a moment. So if you do that many times through the day, even if you're busy working or traveling or shopping or in a monastery or on a retreat, doesn't matter. If you do that many times a day, that's many times your mind is inclining towards Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. So your mind is like that tree in the field. The wind is coming and it's preparing that tree for when it eventually falls, or for when your mind eventually falls when you die and your five khandhas break apart and disappear and you never return, but your mind, your consciousness arises, the next consciousness or the next life arises, and the conditions are there for you to incline or return to Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha again. That's one of the fundamental truths that the Buddha taught, isn't it? That our mind is a conditioned thing. These five khandhas are conditioned. And you have some choice in that. When he says it's conditioned, it doesn't mean it's just destiny, you're going to be Buddhist or not, you'll meet the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha or not. It's not like it's destiny or it's in somebody else's hands. It's in your hands. If you keep recollecting mindfully Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, keep determining to practice the path that he taught, the Noble Eightfold Path, then that's the conditioning you're giving yourself. Well, if we spend all our time worrying or attaching to things, or getting obsessed with things that lead to dukkha and suffering, then that's the conditioning we're giving ourselves. And maybe that's taking us away from the Dhamma. So that's our challenge, isn't it, too? We've got faith in the Buddha now, we've got faith in the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha. We want to practice, we want to experience the peace, the happiness that the Buddha and all the enlightened disciples have experienced. Our challenge is to take this mind and condition it in the way where we're taking refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha and inclining the mind towards Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha over and over again, every day. And it doesn't necessarily mean we have to do great kind of things or complicated things. Taking refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha can also be carried out in very sort of simple way, and sometimes in very small moments or little things can count as well. So like being mindful of one breath in, one breath out can be very significant act of taking refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, but at the same time it's just one moment of being mindful of your breath in, breath out. It's not very complicated, and it's nothing very special in itself. It's actually very ordinary, isn't it? Watching a breath go in, go out. It's so ordinary we overlook it, or we underestimate it and think, how can that help me, watching my breath go in, go out? And people who are not Buddhist or have never practiced before, they often look at Buddhists and laugh at them and say, oh, what good did you ever do for yourself or the world by watching your breath go in and out? Little do they know. You watch your breath mindfully, you're bringing up something that's very special, has a very good nurturing effect on your mind. A moment of mindfulness will bring forth many more moments of mindfulness. It's a very powerful conditioning force in your mind. It brings you closer to the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. And whenever you have a moment of mindfulness, then your intelligence and your wisdom faculty starts to operate. They go together, hand in hand. They support each other. So if you're mindful of the breath in, breath out once, in the next moment you can recognize the impermanence of the breath, the impermanence of whatever other sensations or thoughts, memories are passing through your mind, the impermanence of feelings, pleasant, unpleasant feelings. You can notice impermanence. That's even more powerful in terms of conditioning effect on the mind. The one moment when you see impermanence is one moment when you see the Dhamma. Your mind draws to the Dhamma. As we know, one who sees the Dhamma sees the Buddha. One who knows the Dhamma knows the Buddha. So if you put effort into practicing a bit of meditation every day, and you learn to come back to your breath through the day for a moment, little moments. It may be just one or two small moments here and there, but then sometimes you also do it in a more determined way. So you may have your time where you sit down, bow to Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, meditate for half an hour or whatever time you've got. If you keep doing that, then you're nourishing your mind with these small moments of mindfulness, developing small moments of insight. These are conditioning your mind in a very powerful way. As I was saying earlier in the meditation session, you can't, an unwholesome mind state or thought cannot exist at the same moment as a wholesome one. It's as simple as that. When the Buddha taught about removing distracted states of mind, he had the simile of knocking a peg out of a piece of wood with another peg. In the old days they didn't have nails when they made buildings and chariots and carts and things out of wood. They would join the wood together with pegs of wood. They'd drill a hole and put a peg in to join two pieces of wood. If you want to get rid of the peg, you can get another peg and bang it into the first peg and it will knock it out. So if you're mindful of the breath, then you're knocking out all the pegs of the other stuff, the feelings of anxiety, loneliness, worry, fear, greed and obsession, doubt. Whatever it is that's bothering you, you can knock it out by a moment of mindfulness. Maybe only one moment is needed for you to see that thought of fear or anxiety or whatever it is, irritation, may only take one moment of mindfulness for you to realize it's impermanent, I can let it go. It's as simple as that. Of course, some of our conditioning is so deeply ingrained that you can't just knock out a bit of anger or desire or worry just like that. So you have to keep doing it. Repetition. So this is why we practice mindfulness over and over again. Moments of repeated establishing mindfulness, little by little, knock out the bigger peg of whatever it is that's bothering you. The fear, the worry, the hatred, the despair, whatever. You know, it's like knocking out a peg. If you've ever seen someone do that, sometimes they can't just knock it out in one hit. They have to keep tapping at it, and gradually the peg moves out of the hole until it's gone. So you might have to repeatedly establish mindfulness on the breath, repeatedly recollect Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, repeatedly apply yourself to the practice in whatever way is needed, and then little by little you start to see results. So sometimes it's easy, straightforward, quick results with little effort. Other times we have to expend a lot of effort and the results only come slowly. It just depends what the particular problem is, where the suffering is. But another important thing to remember is every little bit of stress and suffering that we're experiencing that may seem overwhelming at the time is teaching us something. And that's another aspect of taking refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. If you take refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, it means you're willing to learn from everything that you experience. Nothing is off limits. Everything is teaching us. Even our suffering, even our stress is something we can learn from and should learn from, because if you want to get beyond stress, you've got to look at it and observe it and understand it and abandon it, or abandon its causes. But that's the good thing about suffering. It can teach you something, it can make you wiser, and it becomes a basis for becoming mindful and then investigating the truth. So if you're angry, that's where you have to learn, if that's what's bothering you. You have to establish enough awareness to say, oh, this is bothering me. I'm suffering when I'm angry. What can I do about this? That's the process of gradually introducing mindfulness and wisdom into your experience, and maybe you simply reflect on the fact that what is anger? Well, it's a feeling with thoughts, trains of thought, tend to be quite destructive, so the perceptions are very negative. But as you start to unpack it or look at it more closely, you realize all of this is impermanent. Those thoughts and perceptions and the feelings that come with anger, they arise, they pass away. They're changing, aren't they? They're there for a while. Sometimes they're very intense, and then they're less, and then they disappear altogether. And there's plenty of times when we are not experiencing anger. Hopefully at this very moment you're not experiencing any anger, unless you're fed up with the sound of my voice, I don't know. But if this moment you're not feeling any anger, that's already Dhamma, isn't it? That's the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha in your mind telling you, anger is something that is anicca, impermanent. Whatever it causes it, and whatever leads to it to pass away, at this moment you're not experiencing anger, so it is therefore clear that it's something that is impermanent. What is impermanent, is it correct to take it as a self and say, this is me, I'm angry, when you're angry, when at the same time there are times when you're not angry. That's the delusion of mental defilements such as greed, anger, delusion, and all their children that come into the mind. When they're there, because we're not mindful, because we have no insight, we believe them. We take them on, and then we get stuck in them, and they often become more intense, worse, and continue to affect us. So actually, what you could say, when you're angry and you're indulging in your anger, or you're worried and you're indulging in your worry, or you're obsessed with something, you're becoming very sort of greedy, attached to something, and you're indulging in that, at those moments you're taking refuge in greed, anger and delusion. Because at those moments you're giving importance to those thoughts, those feelings, those emotions, and you're saying, this is me, this is who I am. It's from delusion, but at that time you can say, that's what I'm doing. I'm taking refuge in what is not Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. I'm taking refuge in what is greed, anger, delusion, mental defilements that bring us stress and condition the mind in a way that bring us more and more stress. So at that moment you could stop and say, what am I taking refuge in right here? Is it the Buddha, Dhamma, or anger, or greed? If you take refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, it means you're working to establish mindfulness, insight, kindness, compassion, patience, all the good qualities. If you're taking refuge in greed, anger and delusion, well, you're giving into it. You're surrendering to the greed, to the anger, to the delusion at that moment. That's what you're taking refuge in. So of course your mind will incline more to it. It will come up more often, more intensely. Someone was here this morning at the monastery, a Buddhist who meditates regularly and has done for many years, but she said she's got a worry that her anger is becoming more intense over the years, which I would say is a worry. If you are getting more angry and your anger is more intense than it used to be, that's a warning sign, isn't it? There's something wrong. You need to investigate that. Maybe it's a habit that we get used to and just take for granted. We become so used to it that we just say, oh, that's me, that's who I am, I'm the angry one, I get angry, and so we just let it win. We surrender to the anger, meaning we actually are taking refuge in anger and saying, oh, this is who I am, and we don't work hard enough to get rid of it, to abandon it. We don't work at seeing it as becoming mindful and seeing it as impermanent. We don't learn anything from it, we don't become wiser about it, we just give in to it. And unfortunately that's quite common as time goes on. Especially as we get older, sometimes there's more to get angry about, isn't it? You've got to struggle with an aging body, or illness, or not getting what you want. Life gets more complicated as you get older, doesn't it? When you're young, you don't have to worry about much because you've got parents who pay for everything and sort out all the problems and give you all the advice. But as you get older and you become an adult, you've got to start making your own decisions, earn your own money, pay your own bills, and you've got to deal with your own reputation with other people and your relationships with people. Everything suddenly gets more complicated, doesn't it? So it's possible that the effects of greed, anger and delusion do increase as we get older. There's more pressure on our mind. All the more reason to take refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha and use the teachings and the practices we have to help you to get out of suffering. You could say, oh, thank heaven for Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, otherwise I wouldn't know what to do. As life goes on, you've got to as you get older, you've got to face the pain and discomfort of a declining body, aging body, the pressures of paying all the bills, dealing with people, pressures of your own mind, because the longer you live in the world, the more information you accumulate, so you've got more to deal with. For somebody who practices vipassana and contemplates impermanence and not self all the time, well, maybe this will all bring them a lot of wisdom. But if you haven't taken refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, maybe it's overwhelming. And unfortunately many people find life overwhelming the older they get. The more you watch the news, the worse it becomes, isn't it? It's like, oh, another war, another crime, another bit of corruption, another economic crisis, another political crisis. The more you watch the news, the worse things become. And so sometimes people just have news anxiety. Or you go and see your friend and all they're doing is talking about their health problems, and so you talk about your health problems. So the more you talk, the worse things seem to become. The older we get, there's no guarantee the happier we get. Especially if we forget the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, then gradually these 5 khandhas take over our experience, don't they? And that becomes what you know. So you worry about things and you feel pressured by things, and things get painful and complicated and less peaceful and more distracted, and the mind becomes more attached to things. So if you have the good fortune to have come in contact with Buddha Dhamma Sangha, taken refuge in Buddha Dhamma Sangha, then use it. Use that refuge to train yourself, develop yourself. And even the smallest, quickest, briefest moment of mindfulness is better than nothing. Yeah, a moment of mindfulness, the Buddha said, is always useful, always beneficial, never a waste. So even if you just take 3 mindful in-breaths and out-breaths, which we can all do, already you feel a bit better after that. And especially if at that moment you're experiencing some stress, but you just take a few deep breaths, already you feel better. And then when you feel better, you see some of your stress fading from your mind. You can also gain some wisdom and understanding. Say, oh, that stressful feeling is impermanent. It's not really me, so it's not self. That's the beauty and the benefit of Dhamma, is that with Dhamma arising, what is not the Dhamma, which is greed, anger and delusion, start to fade from the mind. But we are the ones who have to make that effort, and it starts by taking refuge in Buddha Dhamma Sangha and really clinging on. Yeah, it's another problem, isn't it, with Buddhists? They come and they say, I hear we should let go of everything, so I'm practicing non-attachment, I'm not going to attach to anything. Well, maybe we shouldn't just rush to not attach to anything at all, and ultimately you could say that's correct. You know, the mind of an arahant, nibbana, is non-attachment. It sounds correct, but before you reach there, you've got to attach to the Buddha Dhamma Sangha, don't you? You know, you cross samsara, the ocean of samsara, on a raft. You don't throw out the raft before you've got to the other side, before you've reached the beach on the other side. If you throw out the raft too quickly, you drown. So don't throw out Buddha Dhamma Sangha too quickly and practice non-attachment too quickly. You attach to what you need to attach to first, which is Buddha Dhamma Sangha, precepts, generosity, mindfulness, insight meditation, all the things that we need to use, the tools. We attach to them first, until the mind reaches the place of non-attachment. But don't throw it out too quickly. Don't throw the raft away and yourself with it. We need to attach in the beginning. Or even the sense of self. We say, I'm practicing to see non-self, which is correct. And we need to investigate that. But before we can see non-self, we have to also develop the self. And we use language all the time, don't we? This self, I am practicing the Dhamma, I am keeping precepts, I am meditating on the breath. You know, it's useful to have a sense of self, but we're cultivating what you might call the good self, the skillful qualities of mind, in order to see beyond the self. You can't just jump to the top of the mountain just like that. It's impossible. You know, if you compare the practice of Dhamma, climbing up a mountain, Nibbana is the summit. You know, nobody can just jump to the summit. We'd all like that. You have to go up step by step up the mountain, and everyone has their own way up the mountain. Some go a zigzaggy way, some go straight up, north face. Some people go around slowly. We all want to get to the top of the mountain, but you go step by step. And that step-by-step process means you have to attach to things on the way. You attach to Buddha Dhamma Sangha, you keep precepts, you use meditation objects, you reflect on the teachings, you listen to Dhamma. You don't throw it all out too quickly. And why? Because you're developing this good self, you're developing a mind that is conditioned in a good, a skillful way, so that it can see the Dhamma, so that it can go beyond attachment. And the Buddha reminded the monks and laity that we have to get used to cultivating skillful states of mind. He didn't just say practice non-attachment and give up from day one. You have to cultivate skillful states of mind, get used to it, so that your mind becomes familiar with that. Some people say, oh, there's no place, you don't really need to practice generosity in Buddhism, you can just practice vipassana and develop insight into not-self straight away and reach Nibbana. And theoretically that sounds correct. On paper that sounds correct. But human beings, have you ever met a human being who had to develop spiritually, hasn't needed to practice any generosity, any kindness and compassion, has never had to, consciously keep precepts and practice virtuous conduct? I haven't. There may be one or two out there who just kind of naturally inclined towards seeing Nibbana and insight into non-attachment, from day one. They're born as a baby and they can see non-attachment straight away. There may be one or two out there, but I've never met them myself. We also have to train ourselves in goodness, train this self in goodness before we can go beyond the self. So we do need to practice generosity. So we become familiar with letting go of stinginess, attachment, greed. We do need to practice kindness and compassion to let go of anger and hatred. We do need to develop mindfulness on objects such as the breath. And of course we need to develop insight into impermanence, unsatisfactoriness and not-self as well, vipassana. But these other qualities we develop are helping that, supporting that. So this is why the Buddha used the simile of a raft. You're crossing the ocean on a raft. You need that raft until you get to the other side. Once you get to the other side, you can discard the raft. You don't need it. You can let go. You don't carry it on your shoulder all the time. But until you've reached the other side, you need the raft. You need to be developing the good self. You need to take refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha. So this is why we still do some of these external practices. We bow, we practice charity or generosity, we sit meditation and walk meditation, we do a certain amount of rituals, and we might listen to Dhamma or even recite the Dhamma or chant. There's plenty of room for variation in all this according to one's personality and what one finds inspiring and what inclines the mind towards the Dhamma. Of course, there's variation between people. But you can't just sit there and say, I'm going to practice non-attachment, not do anything. It sounds good, but the mind won't yet be inclining towards the Dhamma, I feel. We need to practice and establish Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha internally, incline the mind towards these refuges. Then we can really progress in the Dhamma, train this mind, condition this mind, and then you don't need to worry about this life, next life. If you're inclining your mind towards Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, day by day, moment by moment through your life, well, you don't know when you're going to die anyway, do you? Nobody can predict that, whether it's today or in 50 years from now, we don't know. But you don't need to worry about that because you can trust in the refuge you've taken right now. The Buddha is a safe, secure refuge of all human beings. You take this refuge now and you keep inclining your mind towards that refuge day after day after day. Then that's all you need to do as far as preparing for your next life. You've already taken your refuge, you're seeing the Dhamma, you're practicing the Dhamma. It's good enough. You don't need to fear anything else. This is what monks prove all the time when they go and stay in a forest, when they're in the forest and the wind is blowing and the trees are swaying and you're worried a tree will fall on you or there's wild animals about. You take refuge in Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha because you know whatever happens, that's the most important thing. We don't need to take refuge in some of these other things. We can afford to let them go. The bank, the bills, the money, the property, the assets. They're not our real refuge. It's Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha is our real refuge. And when you are feeling afraid or lonely, or despairing from whatever's happened in your life, you go to the Buddha Dhamma Sangha as your refuge. Take a few deep breaths, recollect the Buddha, bring up the patience, the faith, the mindfulness, the wisdom, and I'm sure you'll find this will get you through that problem better and actually turn the problem into something good. Turn it into wisdom, understanding. So maybe for today I'll leave you with these reflections, and if there's any questions we can talk about them afterwards.